Holocaust in Romania is very much a part of the history of the territorial changes that the Romanian state has underwent during the Second World War. For our purposes, I would like to point out the following changes. One was that in September 1940, the northern part of Transylvania was transferred from Romania to Hungarian rule, the northern part of Transylvania. Thus, the fate of the Jews in northern Transylvania in 1944 became part of the Holocaust in Hungary. So from the purpose of being, if we look at them as Romanian citizens, of inhabitants of Romania, they were inhabitants and citizens of Romania in between the two world wars. On the other hand, their fate from 1940 to 1944, it was under Hungarian rule and the Holocaust in Hungary. The two other major changes were in late summer 1940, when Bukovina and northern Bukovina, actually in Bessarabia, were taken over by the Soviets following an ultimatum. And between the summer of 1940 and June 1941, those two territories were part of the Soviet Union. On the 22nd of June 1941, Romania invaded the Soviet Union along with Nazi Germany, or in fact, Romania together with Nazi Germany, or Nazi Germany together with Romania, invaded the Soviet Union, and the Romanians were so-called liberating those territories that a year before were taken by the Soviets. One of their claims was, of course, that the Jews in that period of 1 year in Bukovina and Bessarabia cooperated with the Soviet authorities and helped the Soviets. Thus, a part of the Holocaust in Romania was so-called justified by the Antonescu regime's propaganda that in fact they are repaying the Romanians what they have done during those years, 1 year in fact, of 1940, 1941. Furthermore, in late June 1941, immediately after the invasion of the Soviet Union, the major pogrom in Iași, and there were another wave of pogroms in Dorohoi and other places, illustrated that this so-called motive of Jewish help to the Soviets was of course a lie. Jews in fact did not help the Soviet army in any way. It is true, it could be true, that some Jews were glad when in 1940 the Soviet Union took over from the anti-Semitic Romanian regime those territories. But the major pogroms, the deportations, the mass killing of the Jews when the Romanian army advanced into the Soviet Union in late June, early July 1941, shows that, and then of course the deportations to Transnistria, that in total between 280,000 to 380,000 Romanian Jews were killed, especially, but not only, on those territories in the northern part of Romania. On the other parts of Romania, on the southern part, atrocities were less, and the fate of the Jews, for example, in Bucharest, which had almost 100,000, population of 100,000, was different than in the northern parts. So we can see that the territorial changes had a major impact on the history of the Holocaust in Romania. One of the major findings was made by an Israeli historian, the late Jean Anchel, who emphasized and in fact discovered that there were ready plans, operational plans by the Antonescu regime to hand over the remaining Jews of Romania, and I mean remaining Jews after the atrocities in the north and Transnistria, of handing them over to the final solution to the Nazis. And according to one of his writings of late Jean Anchel, in a 2-volume major book on the history of the Holocaust, published by Yad Vashem, he writes that now we know that the plans were already ready. They were not carried out by the Antonescu regime and Antonescu because of the opportunistic feelings that the war will end with Germany's defeat. Furthermore, he claimed in a very interesting passage that in fact the Jews, the fate of the Jews in Romania depended very much even on the personal mood on a certain day of Antonescu, and in contrast to a more tranquil picture of Jews living under grave conditions, but not under the danger of extermination in Bucharest, a community of almost 100,000 people, answers thesis, which is accepted today, that in fact there were already plans for the deportation of the Jews, and the fate of the Jews depended very much whether in a certain day how the leader of Romania, fascist Romania, the dictator Ion Antonescu, feels on that day, or what is his mood on that day. So in fact, all the Jews of Romania were in an imminent danger, and luckily this plan on the southern parts of Romania was not carried out.